Hi everyone. This is Ayyappan from Zifo's business development team. This morning I was trying to write an introduction to this talk actually. And I wanted to keep it very simple, to align with the topic. But the more I tried, the easier it was for me to resort to jargon, five-syllable words, and concepts that I myself was not sure of. So to understand how the bioinformatics and machine learning expert and our guest for today, Josh Starmer, does it, I went to watch a video from his YouTube channel, and there was a description there, in the opening of the channel, describing what he does. It says something like this. I'm improvising. I don't dumb down the concept. Instead, what I try to do is I build you up so that you are smarter and have a better understanding of statistics and machine learning. I found this very interesting because personally when I'm communicating to people, like my parents or friends every day, I try to simplify or reduce the message, reduce the story, so I can quickly get across some meaning to their side, some vague meaning. And in most cases, I felt proud that I have made people understand some part of it, some get a vague idea of what I'm trying to say, even if not completely. But Josh here says that he focuses on explaining in such a way that the other person feels equipped to get the concept, to understand the concept fully. Would knowing how he does it help us communicate better to our customers who are generally scientists and may not be very tech savvy, or do effective knowledge transfer to new team members? Don't you think so? So Josh, we're all yours. Please fill your seat.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Hello, I'm Josh Starmer, and I'm going to get this presentation going. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a second. I'm going to share just a portion of it. Here we go. Today we're going to talk about the elements of StatQuest. In other words, we're going to talk about how to clearly explain complex topics. In other words, we're going to talk about StatQuest clearly explained. Note, this presentation does not assume you've ever heard of StatQuest before. So if it is new to you, don't sweat it. StatQuest is my YouTube channel. Every day, over 30,000 people around the world, including about half of those 30,000, about 15,000 are based in India. But every day around the world, we've got about 30% of the people, 330,000 people watching StatQuest. And what they want to do is they want to learn statistics. So I've got videos on how to do statistics. They want to learn machine learning. So I've got videos on how to do machine learning. And they want to learn other data science related subjects. But it wasn't always like this. I used to work in a genetics lab and I helped people with statistics. I didn't want them to think what I was doing was magic, so I made little PowerPoint presentations to explain these concepts. And every Friday morning, I would have a little mini seminar where I'd try to teach a little statistics to my coworkers. Eventually, on February 3rd, 2015, I uploaded a little presentation to YouTube that explained R-squared. My goal was simply to have it as a reference for my coworkers. So I worked in an academic lab, and that meant every year there would be new students coming in and students leaving, and it was just new people every time. So rather than have to give the same mini seminar on R-squared, I thought what I'd do is I would record it, put it on YouTube, and then when a new person came to the lab, I could say, hey, if you want to learn about R-squared, just watch this video. But this really wasn't intended for the general audience. It wasn't like my dream was to have a lot of followers or subscribers or even a lot of people watching these videos. They were just a convenience for me to solve the problem of how do I teach these people the same material every year. So in other words, I didn't think anyone else was going to watch this video. However, over the next year, 123 people watched my video, which was pretty cool. And 2 people subscribed, which was super cool. And over the next months, I uploaded a bunch of cooking videos and other StatQuest videos for friends and coworkers. So I've got a video on how to cut an onion because I love cooking, and how to mince garlic because I love garlic. But anyways, this is just a small channel where I was just putting personal videos up for just a handful of people. And my channel stayed small, and that was fine with me. But then I uploaded this video, which attempted to demystify some of the technical jargon associated with something called high throughput sequencing. And if you don't know what high throughput sequencing is, don't sweat it. That's not the important part of this slide. What is important is that in the first year, 7,000 people watched this video and over 48 people subscribed. That was 50 times more people than watched my R-squared video. In other words, things in StatQuest land were going bonkers. However, to put my 7,000 views into perspective, in 2015, an artist named Taylor Swift, she had a music video called Bad Blood, and it had something like 1 billion views. Anyway, to make a long story short, I kept adding videos to my channel, and I switched from using PowerPoint to another program that's basically the same called Keynote. It works better on Apple computers than PowerPoint does, at least for me. And so I just switched to different presentation software. And now people have watched my videos over 17 million times. So I'm still behind Taylor Swift, but for data science, we're doing okay. And over 350,000 people have subscribed. More importantly, people say that StatQuest helped them win data science competitions, pass exams, graduate, get jobs, and get promoted once they have the jobs. So far, no one has told me that StatQuest helped them get married, but maybe that'll happen one day, and that would be really cool. People watch StatQuest because it makes complicated sounding things easy to understand. So here's some comments that people have said about how they can understand these concepts better. And so it's nice to get these notices. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the things that I do to clearly explain complicated sounding things. And by the way, I'm making an effort to say complicated sounding things instead of saying complicated things, because most complicated things are complicated simply because they sound complicated. For example, neural networks sound complicated, but they're actually deep down inside, underneath a lot of terminology, pretty simple things. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today. So here's rule number 1 for how to clearly explain complicated sounding things. Rule number 1 is focus on the main ideas. This is a lesson I learned from my father, who, by the way, just for your information, he used to teach at the IIT in Madras, which is now Chennai. He taught biomedical engineering when I was a child there. Anyways, so this is a lesson I learned from him. He said, rule number 1 is focus on the main ideas. He always told me to focus on the main ideas. Imagine we wanted to teach someone how to drive a car. Should we start by teaching them about fuel injection? Or should we start by describing the master cylinder? And what about the head gasket? Even though fuel injection, master cylinders, and head gaskets are critical parts of cars, they are not the main idea. In other words, we don't need to know about these parts in order to drive. In fact, even though I would bet most of the people watching this seminar know how to drive, I'd be surprised if they knew about these parts. If I wanted to teach someone how to drive, I would focus on the main ideas. I would start by teaching them about the brake pedal so that they can stop the car. Stopping the car is the most important thing to teach first so that we can avoid hurting other people. Then I would teach about the steering wheel so that they can turn the car. The steering wheel is the second most important thing because we can use it to avoid hurting people. Lastly, I would teach them about the gas pedal so that we can move the car. The brake and gas pedals and the steering wheel are the main ideas of driving because you need all three to drive, but you don't need anything else. Knowing about the brake and gas pedals and the steering wheel may not make someone a great driver, but at least they know enough to practice and can easily learn more. Bam! Similarly, when I want to teach someone about a neural network, I would start out with a super simple data set that showed whether or not different drug dosages were effective against a virus. The low and high dosages were not effective, but the medium dosages were effective. Then I would show that fitting a straight line to the data isn't very good because no matter how we rotate the line, it can only be close to 2 of the 3 clusters of points. So what we really need is to fit a squiggle to the data. We can't fit a straight line to the data and get good predictions. Instead, we can fit a squiggle. And the main idea behind neural networks is that no matter how fancy they look or sound, all they do is try to fit a squiggle to your data. Now that we understand the main ideas behind neural networks, we can start diving into the details. Like that these nonlinear functions are called activation functions. And because the activation functions are between the input and the output, we say that the activation functions are in a hidden layer. And there are lots of other details, but we can save them for later, since right now what we're doing is we're focusing on the main ideas. So this is rule number 1, and it's the most important rule of all. It seems simple, but it's easy to be distracted by things that are not the main idea, especially when there's a lot of hype like there is around neural networks. So there's a lot of hype around neural networks, and so it's easy to think that maybe the most important things are the activation functions or the hidden layers or the edges between the layers. No, the main idea for a neural network is that it fits a squiggle to your data, or at least it tries to. Rule number 2 is to have empathy for the audience. Everyone has different experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives, and it is important to keep this in mind when explaining anything. For example, if I'm going to teach someone how to drive, and they know how to ride a bike, then I'll explain how to drive in terms of how to ride a bike. The handlebar is the steering wheel, and the pedals are the gas, etc. In contrast, if they knew how to ride a horse, then I'd explain how to drive in terms of how to ride a horse. Giddy up. And if someone had piloted a boat before, then I would explain how to drive in terms of how to pilot a boat. Anchors away. Lastly, when you don't know your audience, try your best to explain in a way that anyone could relate to. And try to anticipate questions from people that have different experiences. One way to explain things so that anyone can relate to the subject and helps anticipate questions is to use pictures. So that leads us to rule number 3, use pictures. A lot of people are visual learners. If you're not a visual learner, and it's easier to look at this equation than it is to look at this bell-shaped curve, then you need to make sure you understand rule number 2, have empathy for the audience. Regardless of whether or not you are a visual learner, visual cues often make things easier to remember. Here's an example of some unvisual directions to the grocery store. You go straight for 731 meters. You turn pi divided by 2 radians. Go straight for another 1,196 meters. Turn pi times 3 divided by 2 radians. Go straight for 52 meters. Bam! Here's a pop quiz. Can anyone remember the first step in the directions to the grocery store? Some of you might be able to remember, but I'm willing to bet most of the people watching this seminar can't remember. So the first step was to go straight for 731 meters. This direction may be precise and accurate, but it's hard to remember. Here's an example of visual directions to the grocery store. Go straight till you get to the gas station. Turn left. Go straight till you get to the church. Turn right. Go straight till you get to the grocery store. Bam! To summarize this rule, we almost always have a choice between not using pictures to explain something. So here's our unvisual directions, and using pictures to explain something. Pictures are 1, easy to relate to. 2, often help people answer their own questions. So for example, let's go back to this one. When I say go to the gas station, by looking at the picture, they can say, oh, that's a BP gas station. And they can look at the picture of the grocery store and go, oh, that's a grocery store called Harris Teeter. And so that if they have a question of like, what's the name of the grocery store, something that I haven't anticipated, they can look at the picture and they can answer that question themselves. So this helps people learn on their own without me having to do all of the work and anticipate everything. And pictures are easy to remember. Bam. Rules number 4 and 5. Repetition is helpful, and do the math. No matter how simple the equation, plugging in a few numbers makes it way easier to explain. And doing this more than once makes it way easier to remember. My father, another thing he used to tell me when I was a kid, he said, repetition is the greatest teacher. And I know we hate repeating ourselves and doing things over and over again, but it actually is a good way to learn things. However, for complicated looking things, plugging in numbers is crucial and can provide deeper and more memorable insights. For example, let's plug some data into this neural network. However, first, let's remember the main idea. Neural networks fit squiggles to your data. With that said, to keep the math simple, let's assume dosages go from 0 for low to 1 for high. The first thing we do is plug the lowest dosage, 0, into the neural network. Now, to get from the input node to the top node in the hidden layer, this connection multiplies the dosage by -34.4. And then it adds 2.14. And the result is an x-axis coordinate for the activation function. Note, these values come from fitting the neural network to the data with backpropagation. And backpropagation is beyond the scope of this seminar, but it's actually online right now. So if you want to watch it, you can learn how we estimate these values. For now, just know that these parameter estimates are analogous to the slope and intercept values that we solve for when we fit a straight line to data. So just like we can, fit a straight line to data and that we estimate a slope and an intercept, the parameters on these edges that connect the nodes in the neural network are estimated in a similar way. Now, given that we have already estimated these parameters, the lowest dosage, 0, we plug that in. So we multiply that by negative 34.4, and then we add 2.14, and to get 2.14 as the x-axis coordinate for the activation function. To get the corresponding y-axis value, we plug 2.14 into the activation function, which, in this case, is the soft plus function. Note, if we had chosen the sigmoid curve for the activation function, then we would plug 2.14 into the equation for the sigmoid curve. But since we are using soft plus for the activation function, we plug 2.14 into the soft plus equation. And the log of 1 plus e raised to the 2.14 power is 2.25. Note, in statistics, machine learning, and most programming languages, when we just say log function, we're implying the natural log or the log base e. Anyway, the y-axis coordinate for the activation function is 2.25. So let's extend this y-axis up a bit and put a blue dot at 2.25 when dosage equals 0. Now, if we increase the dosage a little bit and plug 0.1 into the input, the x-axis coordinate for the activation function is negative 1.3. And the corresponding y-axis value is 0.24. So let's put a blue dot at 0.24 for when dosage equals 0.1. And if we continue to increase the dosage values all the way to 1, which is the maximum dosage, we get this blue curve. Note, before we move on, I want to point out that the full range of dosage values from 0 to 1 corresponds to this relatively narrow range of values from the activation function. In other words, when we plug dosage values from 0 to 1 into the neural network and then multiply them by negative 34.4 and add 2.14, then we only get x-axis coordinates that are within the red box. And thus, only the corresponding y-axis values in the red box are used to make this new blue curve. Bam! Now we scale the y-axis values on the blue curve by negative 1.3. For example, when dosage equals 0, the current y-axis coordinate for the blue curve is 2.25. So we multiply 2.25 by negative 1.3 and get negative 2.93. And negative 2.93 corresponds to this position on the y-axis. Likewise, we multiply all of the other y-axis coordinates on the blue curve by negative 1.3. And we end up with a new blue curve. Bam! Now let's focus on the connection from the input node to the bottom node in the hidden layer. However, this time we multiply the dosage by negative 2.52 instead of negative 34.4. And we add 1.29 instead of 2.14 to get the x-axis coordinate for the activation function. Now, If we plug in the lowest dosage, 0, into the neural network, then the x-axis coordinate for the activation function is 1.29. Now we plug 1.29 into the activation function to get the corresponding y-axis value and get 1.53. And that corresponds to this yellow dot. Now we just plug in dosage values from 0 to 1 to get the corresponding y-axis values. And we get this orange curve. Note, just like before, I want to point out that the full range of dosage values from 0 to 1 corresponds to this narrow range of values from the activation function. In other words, when we plug dosage values from 0 to 1 into the neural network, we only get x-axis coordinates that are within the red box. And thus, only the corresponding y-axis values in the red box are used to make this new orange curve. So we see that fitting a neural network to data gives us different parameter estimates on the connections. And that results in each node in the hidden layer using different portions of the activation functions to create these new and exciting shapes. Now, just like before, we scale the y-axis coordinates on the orange curve. Only this time, we scale by a positive number, 2.28. Beep, 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 beep. And that gives us this new orange curve. Now the neural network, it tells us to add the y-axis coordinates from the blue curve to the orange curve. Beep, boop, boop. And that gives us this green squiggle. Then, finally, we subtract 0.58 from the y-axis values on the green squiggle. And we have a green squiggle that fits the data. Bam! To summarize, we started with two identical activation functions. But then we plugged in some values and saw how using multiplication and addition slices, flips, and stretches the activation functions into new shapes, which are then added together to get a squiggle that's entirely new. And then the squiggle is then shifted to fit the data. Bam! Now remember the rules we just illustrated here. Repetition is helpful, and do the math. By plugging numbers into the neural network and doing the math, we have a better understanding of how this neural network fits a squiggle to the data. So now we're ready for rule number 6, which is always start with the data. You may remember that if I wanted to teach someone about a neural network, I started out with this super simple data set that showed that a straight line would not fit the data well. So we needed to fit a squiggle to the data. So I let this data sort of create a problem that we could not solve using our standard linear regression procedure. Knowing that we need to find a way to fit a squiggle to the data gives us a context from which we can understand neural networks. Rule number 7, and I've completely violated this rule, is to limit the presentation to 3 main ideas. Generally speaking, when we're talking about data science and things related to data science, especially when you're talking to someone who doesn't do it all the time, like maybe your boss, even though you can clearly explain things, I feel like people only have so much energy with which they can devote to learning something new. And I've found that 3 things is sort of the limit of some people's energy for learning new things. For neural networks, the main idea, number 1, is that we start with identical nonlinear activation functions. Main idea number 2 is that the activation functions are sliced, flipped, and stretched into new shapes. Main idea number 3 is that the curves are added together to make a squiggle that is entirely new. So those are the 3 main ideas in neural networks. And when I try to make videos, a lot of people make fun of me because I say BAM a lot. Well, what I try to do is I try to have a BAM, and that's like one of the first exciting moments in the video because we've just covered a main idea. And then a little bit later, we have a double BAM. And that's when we cover main idea number 2. And then at the very end, because, we've been learning all this stuff, we finally got to main idea number 3. And I tend to say triple BAM. And I've discovered that if I ever try to do quadruple BAM or more than that, it means that I'm trying to explain too much in too little time. Triple BAM. So in summary, I believe that StatQuest, my YouTube channel, is successful because 1, I do everything I can to focus on the main ideas. 2, I try as best as I can to have empathy for the audience. 3, I use pictures. And 4 and 5, I try to repeat. I do a lot of repetition and I plug numbers into the equations, and I just do that over and over again. And when you see it 3 or 4 times, you start getting a sense, an intuitive sense of what's happening and how the equations are working. And rule number 6, I always start with the data. So I let the data define the problem I want to solve rather than starting with a tool and saying, what can I do with this tool? A lot of people, when they teach neural networks, they start by explaining neural networks. No, explain a problem that is best solved with neural networks. And once we have that problem, we've got a motivation for learning something new. Lastly, I do everything I can to limit the presentation to 3 main ideas. Obviously, I blew it here, but generally speaking, when you're teaching data science, try to keep it as short as possible. The end. Hooray. We've made it to the end of my presentation. We kind of flew through that. So that means we have lots of time for questions. If anyone has questions, I see there's a little bit of stuff in the chat, and there's also some Q&A stuff going on.
There's already a question from Raj to you.
Yeah, so I see a question in the Q&A. It says,
yes.
Do you think empathy is an acquired skill or a natural skill? And I believe it's an acquired skill, and I have a story to tell about that. So when I was a kid, I had a friend named Jake Roberts. I was probably 10 years old at the time, and I remember I was trying to tell him a story about something, and I just wanted him to hear my story, and I was really excited about the story. And Jake Roberts, he looked at me and he said, Josh, you are terrible at telling stories. The problem with the way you tell stories is, 1, you start in the middle. What happens is you're thinking about the story on your own, and you're thinking about it and you're thinking about it. And when you open your mouth, because you've been thinking about it, you just start talking about where your brain is right then and there. You need to reset your brain and start at the beginning. And so that's one big problem. The other problem is you're kind of all over the place. Instead of sort of a logical progression of telling your story of like, this happened and then this happened and then this happened, I was like, well, this happened and then something happened like way later, and then but wait a minute, it's because of this thing, and I was all over the place. And the last thing he told me is he said, and you make all these sound effects, and those are the 3 reasons you are terrible at telling stories. And I took those to heart. And I spent a lot of time growing up and trying to understand how to, because I like telling stories and explaining things. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make it better. And his advice was great. Just start at the start. It's very tempting to start in the middle, especially when it's something I've been thinking about. It's easy to assume everyone else has been thinking about it as well. And so I can start in the middle and that's safe, but no, it's not. You always have to start at the beginning. I've also learned how to present in a more linear fashion so that one event leads to another, which leads to another, and we finally end up with our solution. Unfortunately, however, I still have lots of sound effects, and I say bam, and I say double bam, and I go doo doo boop 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 when I tell stories in StatQuest. So the rule is the third thing that he was trying to explain to me. I never learned that part, but for the most part, I've tried to be empathetic. And I also, I used to, when I worked in the genetics lab, I had a friend named Dominic, and Dominic was great. Whenever I tried to present something, I could look at Dominic's face and know how well I was doing. Usually I'd start something and I'd be presenting, trying to explain a t-test or something like that. And Dom's face would go from clear, a clearly understanding face to just like more and more confused. And he would just, you could tell he was getting lost. And so what I would always do is I would look at Dom, and as soon as he started doing this, I'd go, okay, I need to fix something. And I'll be honest, I don't work with Dom anymore. But when I create my videos and I try to explain new things, I can't see anyone right now, but I try to imagine Dom is out there. And I look out in the audience and I see Dom, and I'm trying to do my best to have him look like he understands instead of confused. And so I spent a lot of time just looking at his face and just trying to learn how to teach or explain concepts in a way that kept his face like this and not this. So for me, it's definitely been an acquired skill. Can anyone acquire that skill? I like to think everyone can. I know I have personally, because I was not born good at explaining things. I was terrible at it. But it's just about sort of how much effort you want to put into it. It's not easy, and it takes practice. It's like, running a marathon. You don't just wake up and roll out of bed and run a marathon. You have to practice and train for it. And it might take a long time. It might take a year. It might take several years. I fortunately worked with Dom for several years. And so he helped me throughout that, sort of hone my ability to explain things. So, yeah.
Just a quick question from me. So
Yeah.
when you don't have an audience like Dom to speak to, when the audience are largely unknown, how do you measure their preparedness and knowledge? Especially for in your own case with your YouTube channel, the people you're speaking to are, you don't know about them. You don't know that they are graduates or working professionals or just interested, curious people. So then how do you measure their preparedness? It's easy to underestimate or overestimate the listener, right?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So one, I try to pretend that Dom is confused, and I go, what would I do if Dom did not understand this? Each slide, I'll go, what would I do if Dom did not understand this? And I'll be honest, I demo my presentations with friends, and there's these, all over the world, there are these data science clubs, and now that we have Zoom and we're all very comfortable using Zoom, what I do is I'll do like a guest presentation for a data science club, and I'll just give them a rough draft, and I'll see where they'll start posting questions, and they'll say, hey, I don't get it, and so it's even if they don't have questions, it's amazing when the focus that I get when I know I'm presenting to live, real people, and I can, even without feedback, just knowing I'm doing it, focuses me in a way that goes, oh, I need to correct this. I need to fix this. Here's a mistake. This logical progression is not as good as I thought. I'm making a very big jump here. I need to fill in things. But I do things live and I demo things for people. I have rough drafts. It's not like the first thing you see is the final thing. I edit like crazy. I spend a lot of time, and everything you see that I put up on the web has gone through many rounds of editing and have improved, and some of them have been demoed to live audience. In fact, a lot of them have. So,
so preparation and rehearsal are key. So
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So another question is, how did neural network get its name?
Yeah, so neural networks are shockingly old. They were invented in the 1940s, and back then they were actively trying to create a simple way to model how a brain worked. And so when they had those nodes and things like that, they were trying to act, they're trying to imitate what a neuron would do, and the connections between the nodes were an imitation of a synapse. And actually, they were trying so hard to replicate sort of what was going on in the brain that they actually made neural networks very weak and very kind of pathetic. And the reason what they were doing is a typical neuron in your brain has two outputs. It has 0 and 1. It's either pulsing, like a neuron is either sending an electric signal, or it's not. It's not like it's sending like a a real dynamic range of values. It's either pulsing electronically or it's not. And so what they did is they used something called a sigmoid curve, which capped the output values between 0 and 1. And that was fine in terms of trying to replicate how a neuron worked in reality, but it made neural networks almost, it made them very difficult to train when they got complicated. You can make a very simple neural network like the one I demonstrated. You can have a really simple one, but as soon as you get complicated, and you add multiple layers of hidden nodes, that sigmoid activation function is terrible and it gets in the way. And about 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, it's definitely in this millennium, since 2020, people realized that if they got rid of that sigmoid curve as the activation function, and they use the soft plus curve, or they use something that's related called the ReLU, which is it's flat for negative values on the x-axis, and for positive values on the x-axis, it's just the same value. So it's a diagonal line of y equals x for positive values. Once they figured out that they could throw away their sort of, I'm trying to pretend I'm a neuron. Once they threw away that pretense, they could create what's called deep learning. They could all of a sudden, neural networks were much easier to train, and they were much easier to make deeper and with more nodes. And so that sort of pretending to be a real neuron or trying to simulate a real neuron was actually getting in the way of the performance of neural networks. So that is how neural networks got their name. And I guess it's also why we're no longer trying to call them neural networks. A lot of people now just call them networks or learning networks, or and they don't call the nodes neurons anymore. That's kind of out of fashion. People call them nodes, or so sort of the language is changing now that we're realizing that we're no longer trying to replicate a brain.
So the question we have is, do you have any tips how to not to overcome stage fear?
Yes. Stage fear is a very real thing. I experience it just like everybody else. What's the best way to deal with it? I'll tell you one way I do it. I put all my script on the screen. I just read off the web point, and some people think that's lame. Some people think that's stupid. To be honest, however, I discovered that it's great. And here's why it's great. One, it makes it a lot easier for me. I don't have to improvise. I don't have to freestyle. I know exactly what I'm going to say. Two, I know that what I'm going to say delivers the points in a very clear way. I'm not going to and a lot. I know it's clear because I've beta tested it against live people before. Three, a lot of people that watch my videos don't necessarily speak English, but they can read English or they can translate English. They can type things into a translator. And that's one of the reasons why my videos have a global appeal. It's not just people in the United States that watch my videos, it's people all over the world. And a lot of people that don't actually speak English can still get a lot of value out of my videos. So this is something that helps me feel more confident that I'm going to say the right things and I can do my presentation without being as stressful as I normally would be. And it also, I believe, helps people who are watching the seminar because what I'm saying matches exactly what they're seeing. And there's not like a discrepancy between the image what they're trying to process and the words that I'm saying. So that gives me a lot of confidence. What's another thing to help with stage fright? Practice. The more you do it, the better you feel. And that's something I do, with these data science clubs. I'm going to, hey, we're going to just try this out. It makes me nervous and my hands sweat, whatever. But it helps me, just forces me to do things more. It helps me practice so many things, both how to communicate to people and how to make sure I'm being clear and people are understanding what I'm saying. But it also helps me become more confident and less stressed about giving a presentation.
Right. So you mentioned that putting your text, putting a script on the screen gives you a lot of comfort when talking. And we have a very, a question related to that.
Mm-hmm.
So Raj again asks, if we are stressed or anxious, how do we manage our emotions, especially when stakes are high?
Yeah, obviously for me, knowing that I'm going to go in with an excellent script that I've tested before on people, that's a big help. Breathing exercises, that's another thing. You can meditation. To be honest, when I was a musical performer, I used to play music all the time in performances. That was the thing. I get on stage and I would just take 2 or 3 deep breaths before I actually dove in. It's very tempting once we get in front of people, we realize everyone's looking at us to just like freak out and start doing things. What I try to do is, look, we've got a whole hour. If I do 2 or 3 deep breathing in front of everybody, that's not going to ruin things. So I just do it. I don't have to close my eyes while I do it, but I just breathe in deeply a couple times, get settled, realize I'm in front of people. They're waiting. Sure, there's some anxiety related to that, but they want me to do the best job that I can. They want to learn. They don't want to, like, most people don't want to like see me fail. They don't want to see me do something terrible. They're there to get something out of it one way or the other. And so I know they're there because, and I know they want me to do a good job. They want me to do the best job I can. So I just take some deep breaths, 2 or 3, don't have to do it for a full hour, just to get centered, just to get my mind focused. And then I can look at my slides and there's my script. Bam, I'm good to go. I get in that groove. And, it's like anything, that those first 30 seconds when you're in front of people are incredibly stressful. You take your deep breaths and then you start. And then once you get in that groove, you can forget that there are other people watching.
Thanks. Yeah, that answers.
Yeah.
A personal question. So you mentioned your dad taught in IIT Madras.
Uh-huh.
Have you been there too? And what about the tabla behind you?
Yeah, so I spent a good amount of time in South India and in Madras. And because I'm a musician, I studied music while I was there. I studied tabla.
Wow.
I studied the Carnatic Veena, which is, the big instrument made out of jackfruit.
Of course, yeah.
I love. So I grew up when I grew up in the United States. I played the cello, which is a 4-string instrument. But when I was in India, I didn't have my cello. But the Veena is also a 4. It's got some drone strings on it. It's got 3 or 4 drone strings. But primarily, in terms of playing melody, it's a 4-string instrument. And so it was sort of like the cello for me. It was like, of all the Indian instruments out there, this was like the cello of it. And I like that you played sitting down. Yeah, so I studied music in India. I had a wonderful time. I love, I mean, the musical tradition in India is just remarkable, and to this day continues to be one of my favorites. It's just so rich, and I don't know. It's like you could talk about it all day. It's just a magical tradition, and I love the passion that people have for it, and the music. I mean, I don't know. It's just cool. It's cool music.
Yeah. Interestingly, I've heard that Carnatic music also has a lot of mathematics as its fundamentals.
It's true. A lot of it does.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it has kind of cool patterns and like the ragas. There's
Correct.
just so much there. Yeah.
Wow. So, if we have time, one question.
Oh,
So,
sure.
how do you know you have prepared enough? Sometimes it feels like the presentation is never ready, and we keep tweaking the deck until the last minute.
Yeah. 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 So um, there's a there's a point. It's like anything. Early on, when you're doing a rough draft, it's you make changes and they make big differences. And then you make changes and they make differences. And the later you are in the draft series, the smaller the differences those changes make.
Correct.
Um, and that's when I kind of know I'm pretty close. When I call them lateral changes, where I haven't actually improved the uh, effectiveness of the presentation. I've made a change, but it's like neutral. It doesn't get me forward any. And I can recognize that when I'm just changing little wording things, but yeah, how do you really know? I mean, it's like when you write a song and you're sing a song, you're like, how do you know when that song's done? You just have to decide that it's done. You can always tweak it, but when the tweaks are only making small changes, it's sort of like, I don't know if you're familiar with gradient descent, but gradient descent is an algorithm used for optimizing parameters, and it does it initially. It takes big steps, and the closer it gets to the optimal solution, the smaller the steps are, and the smaller the differences between one value and another. And eventually, gradient descent just says this is good enough. We're taking steps that are so small, we're just going to call this the optimal value. And that's what I do with my presentations. When I know I'm just making little tiny changes, like fixing a punctuation, I'm pretty close to being done. So, but I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my own strategy.
That's relatable. Yeah. So Rob asks, so as someone who grew up before YouTube, I find I prefer learning from books to learning from videos. So
Yes.
do you have any plans to write a book covering your StatQuest content?
Yes, I do, and I'm actually working on it. I had tried. It's one of these
Wow.
things I chip away at. I'll be honest. Writing a book sounds crazy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, who could? I mean, the fact that someone could sit down and write like 300 pages by themselves is completely mind blowing. However, that being said, I've had the opportunity to look at some books that are in rough draft status. So there's a publishing company that sometimes sends me books,
Mm-hmm.
and my job is to read the book and tell them if it made sense or not. And if it didn't make sense, tell them where I got confused.
Okay.
And I've seen some books in rough draft states. And so I've seen how rough they actually are. They're not these finished awesome books that we love and have on our shelves. They are rough. So that was very helpful for me because it made me realize that my expectations can start off very low. That
Mm.
first draft of that book is going to be terrible, and I'm going to want to burn it and make sure no one ever sees it ever. But the point is once you have that first draft, you can then improve on it, and you have something that's easy to kind of work with. So what I do is I spend about an hour to 2 hours every day, and I just hack away at it. And some of it's good, some of it's bad. That's okay. I'll come back and I'll edit when I have time. But the goal, if my goal for 2021 is to write my book, and then in 2022, early 22, is to publish it. So Yeah, so if you're a book learner, and I'll be honest, I'm a book learner too, so there's no shame in that. If you're a book learner, there will be a StatQuest guide to data science and machine learning coming out probably a year from now.
Excellent. Our best wishes, Josh.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. I guess this is probably the last question.
Uh-huh.
So can you
Okay.
talk a little about how you plan the presentation, how you wireframe, structure, and or create flow?
Yeah. Um, that's a great question. Step number one, admit that I'm going to try to focus on three main ideas. But also, so what I do when I'm going to teach something is or like for this neural network sub presentation that we had within the middle of this presentation. The way I did it is I created a very simple data set, and I created a real neural network, and I did this in R, and you could just as easily do it in Python or some other programming language. I didn't code the neural network from scratch. I installed some neural network module, and I plugged in my very simple data, and I trained the model on the data, and it didn't work. It was a disaster. And so I tried it again, and I eventually got to where I could get a neural network trained to my data. And once I had that, I drew a picture of it. I drew a picture of my neural network. And then I just, by hand, ran the data through to see what would happen. And that's when I started seeing the blue and the orange curve appear. And just by plugging the numbers into the data, I was like, oh, I see the plot. I see how this is going to go. I need to explain these curves. I need to explain these red boxes. So things started shaping up. And originally I thought, I'm going to have three main points. I'm going to have a neural network, what it does, and then I'm going to have back propagation, and then I'm going to have advanced techniques, and I'm going to have those all in one video. And I started explaining how the neural network was going to do, and when I got to the end of that, I realized that's all I was going to talk about, because I had three main ideas right there. And that if I wanted to talk about back propagation, I had to talk about that in another video. It turned out I needed 3 more videos to explain back propagation. And now I'm creating new videos. So it went from being 1 video to probably 7 videos. So for me, it's a very iterative process. It's a very organic process. I don't necessarily map out every detail in advance before I dive in. I kind of get a general sense of what I want to talk about, and then I dive in, and then I go, oh, wait a minute. This is taking longer than expected. Let's break it up into smaller units. Yeah. So that's my story.
Thank you very much, Josh. It was a very insightful conversation, and especially being in the knowledge industry, we have to communicate day in and day out to different people who may understand technology, who may not. So we found it very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people would have taken away your rules, and they would implement it in daily conversations.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be able to speak for you guys, and I really appreciate it and the time you guys have spent listening. It means a lot to me. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the time to listen.
Yeah. All right. Until next time, quest
Bye.
on.
Yes. So if there are any specific questions, I'll email them to you probably.
That would be perfect. Yeah, just email them to me. You can also, people can contact me directly. It's josh.starmer@statquest.org.
Perfect.
I can't answer everybody's question, but I'll do my best. I always read every email I get. So.
Wow. Thank you, Josh. Thanks for that.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.